Hello and welcome to another paint over. So this week we're talking about doing an interior scene. Some techniques we'll be looking at was photo bashing and applying a sense of lighting to them. Alright, so the student originally presented these three sketches. The idea was for a sanctum of sorts, kind of like a collector's room with lots of antiques, lots of relics and artifacts. And yeah, it was a great start. They ultimately went with the bottom choice, and then we kind of got that a little bit more refined, and it looked like this. And I think this is a fabulous start, and now it's really just about pushing the idea further. For me, the room feels way too simple in many aspects for what they're going for. The texture design is a bit simple, the object and materials are a little bit on the simple side. The room itself is very boxy and simple. So simple is often not the worst thing to go for, but this is an exquisite type of room. It's by refined taste, and it has a certain amount of elegance to it based off the reference they had sent me. So we try to break that down, add a lot of complexity to the room, basically break up a lot of the edges, add a few elevation changes, knock out the wall where the fish tank is, and we're going to be extending it in depth kind of that way to show kind of a larger space. And that's kind of where we'll pick up on the paint over itself. But before we begin, I'd show just a little bit of kind of where we're coming from. The student took a little bit of a uncommon approach to this. They found a photo that kind of already had a very similar perspective than what we talked about, drew, and discussed, and they just started grabbing photos and kind of kit bashed the scene together using many different types of photos and skewed them and warped them, and it kind of was looking like this midway through. A valid approach, something I don't do too often, if ever, but there's a good sense of speed that can come from this sort of thing if you're knowing kind of a very specific direction you're going for. But the danger that we go over today in the critique is that if you don't know lighting that well, if you're not sure how to blend the photos, things can look a little bit flat and garish. So that's what we'll be adjusting. Alright, so I just did about a 20-minute paint over on this, and I just want to run you through what I did. Basically, you have all the details and everything kind of right in place. You did great work on the photo side. The design, since I last seen your sketches, has improved exponentially. So let's really just kind of tweak and get the lighting kind of working at this stage. That way you can figure out if you'll need additional details, and of course at this point we can start to filter out some of the details. So what I'm doing here is I'm selecting a value range within your shadows, and I'm removing that contrast. Essentially I'm softening your shadow areas and grouping them together to basically filter out some of the information that you have there. It'll also give it another benefit, and that benefit is to have it looking a little bit more natural. We'll start to see the light bloom into those shadows, and again, that will further soften them. It's a little bit more of a cinematic touch, but I think it'll lend itself well to your piece here. The second thing I'm doing is I'm grabbing a color range from within the shadow area once more, and I'm going to start to tweak those balances further. So I'm grabbing the shadows from the foreground, kind of like you see going on here, and I'm just grouping them with some of these basic filters. I of course messed up the first time. I had the wrong layer, so now I'm running the cutout filter in the filters drop down menu. And so that way, doing this really allows me to group things in a fairly simple way like this, almost making it too simple, so I can use this layer desaturated to select groups of values. And that's exactly what I just did. I selected a group of value ranges that kind of were in the mid to dark, and now I can group them all a little bit further. So now I'm going to start to select some of the individual pieces. So this kind of selects everything else besides the that area, and as you can see, I'm balancing these levels to simultaneously lose some of that detail further, and as well as lighten up a little bit more, adding a little bit of that light filter, giving it a little bit more of a hazier effect. That can be brought down to a personal taste, admittedly, but I think it lends itself well to your scene and the atmosphere here. So, take that with a grain of salt. I'm also just smoothing out some of the filter that I lost as it pixelated some of the edge work. And I'm doing the same exact thing within this far range, right? I want to show that it's a little bit further. I added just a hint of blue to that area to isolate it even further and to push it down there. Though you could have almost used any color. Green, one little light pass of green in there actually would, in retrospect, would have made that even better. And I'm doing that within the two pillars that you have here and among some of these other areas. So I'm keeping this at this stage pretty zoomed out since I'm doing all lighting and color and value tweaking. It definitely helps me see the whole thing. I'm coming in here on the same layer with overlay. I'm overlaying it using an overlay brush with this mid to dark range orange, and I'm adding contrast and darkening the edges and the corners, basically away from that main center light that you had on the ceiling. That would increase the effectiveness of how it's affecting the immediate area. And I'm kind of doing the opposite here. In this case, I'm just grabbing that light and experimenting with how I can get a little bit of bloom on that. Again, that's more of a lens effect and stuff, but again, I think it really will, in my honest opinion, lend itself well to the look that your scene's going for. And this is me attempting this again in the upper range. So it starts off a little bit strong and kind of tapers off as we feather it away from the environment or from the source. Again, coming back to burn in, and by burn I mean overlay in some of those warmer colors surrounding the light to increase how it can look. So I'm taking huge sections of the image like I'm doing there, and I'm just running levels on it. So I copy paste it. I'm balancing the levels like I've been doing all along to help that depth. I'm imbuing it with a little bit of those colors using color adjustment, and now I'm just manually erasing with a giant airbrush eraser some of those effects so it has a natural transition, therefore setting into your existing scene. Now what I'm doing is something slightly on the experimental side, but I'm running the posterize filter on this. This is very much getting these subtle kind of gradations in terms of color that you kind of see around that upper right light at this point. Like it adds a little bit of greens and a slight hint of purple. And I'm dropping this layer to a colorize blending mode, and that'll make it even more subtle. So it's not making the image too grainy, but I like the hints of color it drops in up there. And again, I'm balancing out the values in the sitting area to help the shapes work a little bit better with each other. So I'm not adding detail to the scene at all, but I'm trying to get little hints and tidbits of your shapes to pop even more than they already are. And that's just careful using two tools, the lasso tool and the levels tool. Now what I'm doing is I'm removing even more access detail in the scene. So I'm running the filter median on it under the noise, and I'm smart sharpening that. So I'm removing detail while sharpening kind of what's left of it. Then basically what I'm doing is I'm hiding the whole layer, and I'm going to mask in manually where I want the detail. So anywhere that you see like around this light as I'm zooming, see as I mouse over these areas, the detail is just crispening up exponentially. So I'm just selectively going around that in any area that may be affected by the lights in your scene, and that's bringing out the details and almost adding like some added specular highlights to it. And you can see as I turn the layer on and off there the difference. And so it's basically getting everything into the low to mid value range and removing extra crisp details from that range. Again, further just filtering out what we want to show the viewer and what we don't want, which is certainly a challenge when we're using so many photo elements that usually does have crisp, perfect detail. Just because it has that detail doesn't mean we need to or want to show that. Now I'm running the same kind of level filter again, removing more detail, brightening up the whole thing, adding a tinge of green to everything to further kind of this atmosphere. And basically then I'm going to erase a lot of this out. So I'll only pull this layer back in right around the immediate light sources. See, there's the difference. Now I'm going to shut it off and mask in where I want it. And that's something, again, one of the other major techniques I've been doing throughout this whole process. And you can see when I'm mousing over and getting that light back in, see it's adding nice magentas into the shadow of the sofa, adding, again to the left one, adding greens into the shadow areas of the rug, it's softening everything, but I'm also subtly imbuing it with these hints of other colors. I want to add a little bit more of a direct light effect around that light, so that would be essentially, as that shape I just made there would be casting a shadow on it. And so I just used the wrong blending mode there, but even grabbing color dodge, see I make it slightly brighter around that, adding that nice natural cast shadow from the table itself. And I always look for little areas like that within your given parameters to see if I can, again, make things look a little more convincing. I'm going to do the same thing with this area back here. I copied the whole image onto itself, so I can grab this very specific selection. I want to add just a little bit of green, and I'm going to do that thing with the light again, where I'm adding little bits of green around that main light source, so I can feather it delicately back in to add more subtleties to your lighting. And each one of these steps does not do much or look like much on its own, but I guarantee it'll make a nice difference if you compare your original to what this new balanced lighting will ultimately achieve to it. So see, throwing in green, all those shadow areas, and I'm just kind of feeling my way through this, like trial and error, just adjusting these sliders to see a little bit closer to that look. And now I'm going back in. You can use a texture brush if you like texture. You can use a soft air brush like I have been doing. There's a lot of ways to subtly get some of these nice greens and lighter areas into those shadow zones like you just seen here. So I just have that light around it, and that's the difference. And yeah, good luck.